As I think I told you, the archeology of commandment and also will, about which we spoke in our seminar, is for me an investigation still in progress. So that's also why we cannot have conclusions. I avoid conclusions in general, even if the investigation is, so to speak, finished. In this case, particularly, it's still going on, and especially as far as the concept of will is concerned, because we just remain in the context of theology. But, as you know, this concept became a fundamental concept in philosophy, modern philosophy, idealistic philosophy, Kant, Hegel, Schelling, etc., etc. So I don't know how I will continue this archaeology, because if I really try to do a complete archaeology of the concept of will, this will mean a huge work. So I don't know how to continue this investigation. What is clear, and I hope it's clear for you, I'm trying to focusing on a criticism of this concept, trying to show how they were formed, for which strategies they were employed, and also the contradictions, the implications, the consequences that they exerted on our culture. Philosophy, ethics, politics, etc. So now, what we can do now is to open a debate on those, on the whole of the seminar. Also, we also made a lot of digressions, but they are relevant. I think in some way they were connected to the problem. So I leave the word to you. The only thing, perhaps I will stop some minutes before, because I have a lecture in the night. So perhaps just to be able to be at 7 already eating. Okay, let's discuss.
It's a bit of a wild question. Going back to the notion of oath and perjury, and we talked also about contract or marriage and divorce. First makes me think of the logic of advertisement, but very especially of one advertisement from one clothes brand that says just be stupid. So this logic of commandment in advertisement, but the question actually is, maybe think of one work from Paul where he talks, and I understand that also as in this notion of a promise and something that is not, or the possibility of the promise not to be realized, when he talks about the notion of the accident. There he talks about, for example, when they sell a plane, the plane can travel, can bring a certain amount of people from here to there, but the plane can also fall. And there can be also, instead of 300 people traveling from here to there, there is also the possibility of 300 people dying on the way. And that, his critique is that, so I would say the perjury is not taken into consideration in our society or in our contemporary culture. I don't know, that's not a question, it's more a comment.
I know it's completely true, because here it's not really a perjury, because they are not swearing that they will bring you to the other city. In some way, they are aware of the possibility. What I tried to show is that oath can be useful to understand this idea of anarchy of commandment. It is a primitive form of language, the peculiar force of language which defines the commandment. And their oath really is a very interesting phenomenon, also because it is probably the oldest institution. It is everywhere. But then, as you remarked, it is intrinsically linked to the possibility of perjury. So it's not true then oath is meant against perjury. Perjury is contained in oath. The possibility of perjury is contained in oath. And this was clear for the Greek, for instance, for some of them at least. And this is important because this means that oath was not meant to avoid lie, to avoid perjury, to avoid... so its function must have been another. So the idea that oath was created in order to guarantee the sincerity, the truthfulness, to avoid lie, etc., is not correct. Clearly, cannot do nothing for that. So what I try to understand, what could have been another strategy? In which strategy oath was taken? That's why I tried to bring it together with the idea of an original commandment, an original event of language, where the problem is to establish the link between language and word and things. So, a lot of things to say about oath. Speak slowly and loud.
I'm curious if affirmation is something that you ever had, that you have found the need to deal with in the context of oath, commandment, will, and then affirmation. The way I'm thinking about affirmation has to do with the way in which Edith also has proposed it in the context of poetry, and the poet being that person which affirms something clear.
It depends what do you mean by the term affirmation. I would place it as an assertion on the side of what we call the apophantic logos. So it's an assertion, a statement. I state this. It is in this sense, affirmation in this sense, because affirmation can also mean confirmation. But if we take affirmation in the sense of a statement, I say this.
Yes.
Then it goes not on the side of commandment, etc., but it goes apparently at least on the side of the apophantic logos, so on the side of science, reason, etc.
I'm just curious what you think, or if there may be any relationship between commandment and writing. I mean, if we think of the 10 Commandments, they're written on tablets, and then Moses drops them and needs to go get another set of them written again on tablets. And if there's any sort of connection between the act of writing and inscribing the commandments that somehow changes it, or
This makes me think. There is an important fact. What we see as far as the history of law is concerned, capital law is concerned, it is like you say, we always see in the history of Roman, Greek law, and probably also Jewish law, a link between law and writing. In some way, law must be written. As if we can suppose that at a certain stage an oral law existed. But when we go back to the history of our institution, we see law by definition must be written. So we had written archaic Roman law, we had Greek laws, insert sometimes, but we know that the fact of being written was essential. Now, if you go to the commandments, they are in the Bible, they are written. They are just dictated by God, so at that moment they are oral. God does not write. Or perhaps, as the Bible has been written in some way by God. So there is this curious link between law and writing, which has been observed, not really explained. why law needs to be written. You can say, yeah, it needs to be written for a reason of clearness, in order to be fixed. But for instance, we know that the old pontifical order in Rome had also oral traditions. But as far as the law is concerned, you're right, in some way it must be written.
And arche is also the same root that we get the word archive from, is that right?
Yeah, of course. What they concern the antiquity, the origin. No, this, we start from this ambiguity of the term arche, origin, commandment. But all the vocabulary of the archaic, comes of course from this.
So we brushed over Kant, and the impression that I get is that you perceive the you must, can, will as a limitation of potentiality, a supreme limitation. And I think I see that too, but I also think he does a very interesting thing insofar as he takes the interiority of will and he externalizes it. In the famous categorical imperative, sort of, man is given radical freedom, but like Hegel says, that's exactly what haunts him. So the realization of that freedom comes through a kind of alterity. Yeah? So, but with Kant, it's a replacement of the moral law with natural law into the noumenal, which is unrepresentable, right? And a very interesting thing happens insofar as we must both escape what he called the empirical realm and always orient ourselves to this. Yeah? So, but might we actually see Kant as making the moral law in some ways inoperable? Or can we conceive of an ethics without a moral law? Because I don't think that any of the German idealist tradition has conceived of an ethics without a reliance on the moral law. Whether it's something that is that Saint Paul would make inoperable, as we saw, and I know that in Badiou's text, Saint Paul, the Foundation of Universalism, he does a very interesting radical reading, kind of creating a kind of socialistic, extreme potentiality for subjectivity. So I guess my main question is, can we see in German idealism a treatment of the moral law as making a ground for greater potentiality, or is that simply a limitation? Because it relies on alterity, relies on the realization in history and the realization of community for Hegel, etc. Realization of the idea. I'm just wondering what we think, and if we can even presuppose that we can go around this period of Western philosophy.
So you're aware of how big is your question. So first, I didn't really mean that this strange Kantian formulation, you must, can, will, is a limitation of potentiality. What I wanted to underline is this really knocking together, tying together these three modal verbs. It's really something insane. What is really the meaning of that phrase? You must, can, will. What does it mean? So, anyway, it's not the point. Then, as far as the problem is concerned, what I would object to Kant, also the less object is the very idea that ethic, moral, is a domain of law. That such a thing as a moral law is constitutive to ethics. This is the question that we have to ask. And also then there is another thing that in some way Kant, are we sure that Kant is really defining moral law, or is he transferring theological juridical concept to the sphere of ethics. We always will speak of a tribunal, of a judgment. That's the objection Deleuze makes. Why he's so obsessed by judges and tribunals, etc. Then also, so answering quickly to your question, what I'm trying to suggest, on the contrary, as you said in the first question, is, on the contrary, an ethic conceivable without the idea of law? Can we conceive an ethics without using the idea of law? And I think this is absolutely possible. No? And then also, for instance, it's very simple. If you go back to Greek philosophy, they have no notions of an ethical law, of course. And even the concept of duty, which is so important in Kant, because you must, Kant will, the concept of duty is in some way extraneous to the tradition of ethics up to certain point. For instance, the Spinoza's ethics is built without the concept of duty. And the main concept, for instance, in Aristotle, ethic is not duty, it's happiness. Both politics and ethics are grounded for Aristotle on the idea of happiness. So, one chapter one could write a genealogy. We could continue. How did the concept of duty enter the ethics, enter the body? And I think it was first through the Christian theology, but mainly through the work of Kant. And Nietzsche also makes some criticism in that perspective. Do we need the concept of duty in ethics? Can we construct an ethics without having recourse to the idea of duty? It's a question. I'm not saying it's very easy. It's not very easy, but I think it is possible. And then we try to build an ethics in that direction. What do you think? Do you think it's possible to build an ethics without the
Yeah, absolutely.
law?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Aristotelian eudaimonia conception of happiness is also quite problematic. It's somewhat relativistic.
This idea of the happiness as being the central concept for ethics has been often criticized. This is the eudaimonistic conception. Yeah. This is a pagan. No, let's try to think again the concept of happiness.
Yeah, but you even see it in the movement of psychoanalysis with Freud, and superego almost takes the Kantian noumenon to a degree, in the same plane. So
because then, what makes both the limit in the sense we saw, but also the interest of Kant, is that the moral law, as you know, in some way is empty. Because it's just that we have maximum in order that the action could be the maximum, etc. So the law is not prescribing anything. But the idea of law is strongly maintained. Really, it's just an absolute pure law. The most pure form of law conceivable. And then there is something that we should not forget. I don't know if you remember then, you know who was Eichmann. So during Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, we have a beautiful book by Hannah Arendt, but we have also an extraordinary movie which just is a montage of all what they, during the trial, all the trial was filmed. And so we have this Israeli film director, Zidan, who made 2 hours of incredibly interesting. You see Eichmann's film. So,
who's the filmmaker, sorry?
Pardon?
Who's the filmmaker?
Eyal Sivan, I think, if I'm not correct.
I actually thought it was Chris Marker.
No. This is just this is not a movie of invention. It's just the material of
Because I saw at the
Eyan Sibal.
I saw at the Berlin Documentary Forum that A.L. Sivan presented this film, but he said that this is a secret film that Chris Marker gave to him.
No, it's not true, I think. Or perhaps Chris Marker made the idea, and then but he realized he made this. So, an interesting point is that in order to defend himself, Eichmann said at a certain moment, just follow the principle of Kantian ethics. Meaning this idea of the absolute law. You must obey absolute law. Then the prosecutor said, this must not be true, probably never read Kant. And then asked, what do you mean? Can you precise this? And he said something who showed that he really had read in some way Kant, or had an idea of this Kant. And Hannah Arendt comments on this, and she suggests that this Kantian idea, this seems so purely ethical, but then if you see from the perspective of Eichmann or Nazi German, then it can become the idea that you have the main ethical act is just obey to a law. What Eichmann did, as you know, if you Eichmann was not at all a monster, was just a very simple man, ordinary simple man, a good father of family, etc., not at all a perverse criminal. But he just decided that he had to obey absolutely the law. So he went very far. So this is another possible objection. If you introduce the idea of an absolute duty, of course, it was not what Kant meant, because this idea of law is empty. It's not all that this particular thing. But it can become a justification for this kind of action.
Another question concerning ethics. Yesterday you touched on the fact that as opposed to Badiou's ethics, which relies on the notion of a fidelity to the truth, that you believe that once man enters into language, that his ethics should be grounded in a fidelity to language as such. And I'm wondering what this looks like. That you were saying that for you, once man enters into language, that his ethical system should be grounded in language as such and not a discourse or a content within language. So I was just wondering if you could flesh that out more and describe what it looks like to be faithful to the form of language.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I think it's clear that any fidelity which will build as an absolute principle this ideology, this other affirmation, this faith, this proposition cannot be run. So this is a clear preference. No real ethic can be grounded on the you must believe this and this and this and this proposition that the horse are white, that God is that, etc., etc. So no intralinguistic formulation can really be read as a... Then what does it mean to be the fidelity to language as such, to the experience of language as such? It's not easy to understand. I think once an intellectual made on ethics, Wittgenstein says, not if I'm quoting correctly, but seems like something like this. He says, the only possible to the idea of the existence of the world could be the existence of language as such. Then if you ask, but then which kind of ethic could respond to the existence of language as such? Can we conceive an ethic which will respond to the fact that we are speaking beings? So not that we say we believe this and this, but the pure fact that we are open into language. We are just speaking. So the idea was to probably the ethical form of life is a response to the fact that we are speaking. That's what I was suggesting. So this does not formulate a peculiar ethics, but it's more an ethical form of life. Why do men have an ethical form of life? Or even if you say a political form, because ethics and politics go really together. Why do men have an ethical and political form of life? Because they had to respond to the fact that they are speaking. To this openness, which is the fact that we are speaking. We are not closed in dark unspeakability. We are speaking.
Back to the idea of duty and ethics. Do you think that today we still, the modern subject of contemporary society still sees duty as like that ethical call, as like you were giving the example of Eichmann. I see it very clearly in Nazi Germany, where like nationalism and the call of duty was something that permeate the whole subjectivity. It was something that was really, it was a real call. But nowadays, I think it's been very eroded, that concept. People, for the most part, don't see duty as something that it's not a calling anymore. It's a very individual thing. I'm looking for my happiness. I don't care about the call of like community or nation or. It's a very hedonistic kind of like call. It's not it's still there, but it's been very eroded. It's considered.
Yeah, it's possibly you are partially right for a part, but I think another things that happen in modernity, it is that ethical was confused with law. The juridical, the ethical and the juridical in modern time are confused. So we often use juridical concepts as if they were ethical concepts. Also Kant is an example, no? The idea of law. The idea of law comes from, of course, the juridical tradition. Then even the idea of responsibility. That we can think as modern think as an ethical concept also. It is a pure juridical concept. Comes from the Roman institution of the sponsor. Who was the sponsor? The sponsor was one person who promised to guarantee the obligation of another person. And also, the father, when promising the daughter in marriage to another man, promised, engaged himself. That's why the woman was called the sponsa, spouse. Do you say spouse in English? It comes from the juridical Latin term sponsa, meaning promised. So you see how a juridical concept, purely juridical concept, then is developed and becomes. And so, I do not agree completely with what you say, because then it partly is true. The ethical aspects of this concept is a little but the juridical concepts are often interiorized by modern citizens. So, see, and then there is a confusion between the ethical and the juridical. It's strange because, for instance, take a country like the United States or even Italy. Traditionally, these were countries where the individual felt himself free from the construction of laws, etc. No? But then, if you go now in the United States, they are obsessed by norm, obedience, measures, laws. They interiorize completely. You do not really. So the idea of the cowboy in the Western tradition does not exist anymore. They just act in execution of the law. And Europe also, it's evident. No? There is this hyper-proliferation of laws, which is presented as something ethical, good, meant to assure the security. But I think we live in this situation of a proliferation of law and also an interiorization of law as if it were ethical. Because when you interiorize the law, you are not sure that it's juridical. You are transforming it in some way in an ethical concept. So perhaps the idea of moral duty disappears, but the idea of juridical duty is strongly present. The absolute thing which is happening in modern countries today is that the crisis of legitimization. Are you familiar with the distinction between the legitimacy and legality? So the legitimacy is what grounds and legitimates a system, a state. Legality is what the law, the positive law. So we have a crisis of legitimacy. People are no more convinced of the legitimacy of their regime, states, authority, constitution. But this goes together with an incredible, never known proliferation of legislation laws, which really now legislate on everything, like the absurd legislation on smoking. 50 years ago, nobody would ever go, legislation on smoking. It's like that. Everything is legiferated. It's juridically regulated. It's the most stupid thing. And I'm sure that tomorrow they will make law to explain how is the correct way to piss. If they explain how is the correct way to smoke, they could also explain what is the correct way to piss. But this was unconceivable. Only 50 years ago, the idea of regulating this kind of thing. And this goes with a kind of confusion between what is moral, what is legal.
Yeah, I want to actually respond to Hiram and Zoya, because I think what you both asked in some ways really got me thinking about language as such and response or call. You said, where do I receive the call from? So thinking through these two questions, I think we bring up a machine of speaking or not speaking, or responding or not responding. So one of the things I'm thinking about in terms of ethics today, not related to law, is this question of the ability to respond. So responsibility that is articulated through this language as such. So I don't know if you have any comments about this idea, but I think the machine of silence or speaking or calling or responding or not responding is something that I'm sort of trying to puzzle through now as being related to what we've discussed.
To respond, in the sense you are now using it. It's not the same way, the same thing as the juridical precise responsibility for an action. No? It does not mean that you have to ascribe an action or impute an action to you. It's really another idea. It's more the idea of the opening of the space for your ethical action. Whereas responsibility is really the idea that something is imputable, that you are liable to this.
Right, and I want us to think through it differently through this idea of speech, of speaking, or language as such, right? Speaking or not speaking instead. So an ability to respond. This is a different way of perhaps thinking about it.
A juridical question. So the idea that I have a certain sanction, if I kill someone, for example, is based on the idea of will and responsibility. But we also see, at least I would observe nowadays, that there is an increased tendency to try to trick this logic, either by psychiatric recourse, to say I'm mad and therefore I'm not responsible, or also corporations and companies have this concept of limited liability, where actually they cannot really be judged by their willed actions. I wonder if you can comment.
The first aspect, the psychiatric, so if the person who committed this act, this crime, was in the moment of the act in possession of this will, faculty, etc., this does not contradict the idea of will, on the contrary, because it means it's taken seriously. So if will is the criterion to ascribe an action, then you have to prove that will was possible there. So you have to prove that the act was really will. So the first part is perfectly coherent. Then the second, on the contrary, this comes today of the liberal paradigm of opening space of exception for the economic action. There is really no space of exception, where you should be responsible according to the law, but sometimes it's not really formulated by the law, it's just practice. But sometimes it's even formulated. More often it's just a practice.
Going along with what you were saying about one of the characteristics of modernity being the internalization of the previously separate realms of ethics and juridical realm. You also said that similarly that there was an internalization between potentiality and actuality in the case of Paul, I think it was, and in St. Augustine's case, I think it was an internalization of basically the two wills to do and to not do. So I guess my more specific question is, do you then consider Paul and St. Augustine to be moderns? And my more general question, which maybe is a little bit too vague to answer here, is what other characteristics are there in your view? I'm always interested in observing how the general amorphous idea of modernity keeps creeping backward through history, and including more and more people from the past.
You're right. Then first we should try to define and understand these kind of categories that are employed in history. So where typically ends, where then begins, you know that there are many different positions, and mentioned the word ends with before the empire, and then begins or before. So these are not really precise concepts. We use according to certain strategies. But I would answer without feeling to be precise. Yeah, in some way I think that Paul and Augustine are modern. Because I that the ancient man is no longer exchanging. And, it's always a strange problem to answer. How did the ancient world become Christian? How did it happen? It's really strange. It's really not easy, because then there are concrete reasons when the Church and the Roman Emperor made an alliance, Constantinople this was a great moment. But then why pagan and weak-minded philosophers converted to Christianism? Why a man like Augustine, who was a cultivated man, they decided to. What we see is really it's a big anthropological change. In that sense, I would say they are. One boy is a Jew, Augustine, Jew. So they are completely different persons. But we see that everything converged in a new way of thinking. That's why we attempted to answer, yes, I consider in some way as beginning as being modern. Then if we go now, if we like Paul said, the problem can have division. But the problem how we establish division in general in history is a great methodological and epistemological problem that historians do not want to clarify. For instance, we are accustomed to think history with the conceptuality of centuries. So you will have an historian who will say, I am a specialist of France in the 14th century, or I am a historian of Italy from the 13th to the 15th century. It's just you need to think for a minute to understand that this is absolutely crazy, because century is a numerical convention. It cannot correspond to a reality. But then, in the historical practice, we see it as a reality, as if a numerical convention, modern numerical convention, way of counting the years, could correspond to something real. So the century begins here, and this makes a coherent reality. Then, of course, historians know it's not like that, then they will make the century begin 10 years before, and but they continue to use this thing, and they need even to be more scientific, because if you are not a specialist of 1 or 2 or 3 centuries maximum, you are not serious. They're completely crazy, because it's a modern convention. You know, the first to use the century was an historian of the church. In the 16th centuries, he has this idea of making the history of the church, and he spoke in this century. For the first time, he employed the category century. Then, for some 100 years, nobody employed this category. Then, in the 18th centuries, so it is the threshold of modernity, again, people spoke of the 18th century, 18th century, and since that moment, now we continuously use these categories. And these categories are devoid of any possible content because it's just a numerical convention. So just to see how history is very interesting but very epistemologically inconsistent history. Right, with the conceptuality, and also, for instance, we use a certain chronology, which in our Western tradition starts with Christ. Is that a good epistemological grounding for history? How can an historian work on this basis? It's strange. Why should we begin from Christ, then before Christ, then after Christ? So let's see how deeply theology pervades.
Well, I have an observation that you may want to comment on, or a relevant question related to it. I don't know whether it happens in elsewhere in the world, but it happens in my country that the warning sign.
Hey, let me just ask a question. In China, you use the Western chronology or a different one?
Same way, we used to. Well, we use all the Western thing because it sounds more authoritative to us. Especially in Hong Kong because we have this colonial system. We use the century system.
But also the Christ.
Christ
after Christ.
Well, but two systems.
That's particularly the same for me.
But two systems actually works parallelly. We officially use the Western calendar, but sometimes we use the lunar calendar as work. Like the generation of my father and mother, they use this to remember their birthday. They use the lunar calendar to remember the birthday. But for like public holiday, we use the Western.
What's the year in the Chinese calendar? Is it the same year as the Western year? No. So what is the timing of that year based on?
Well, I'm not quite knowledgeable about that. Just due to my ignorance. But this question is kind of relevant to in the past in Hong Kong, the warning signs usually says something strong like no smoking. So it sounds really strong to me. It's like an imperative for us not to smoke. But then in this 10 years, it kind of changed into something like the one who smoked will be prosecuted. And it sounds more weak. It sounds weaker for me. But then it doesn't mean that the law is loosened. It means that more detailed activities are under regulations, and you know, many signs become available in the toilet or in the park or wherever. So this is an observation. And my question related to it is that I want to know your opinion about the passive voice, in the grammar, and how it relates to
will be persecuted.
Something like that. And how it relates to the subject where human enter into the language, because it sounds to me it seems like if the subject becomes passively manipulated by the verb, it seems to me that it is responsibility or it sounds like it is there's between the subject and the verb.
Like always, grammatic question are very interesting philosophical questions. So the two categories of the passive and the active, which were developed by Martin, of course have an implication on the conception of subjectivity. I'm not sure that the fact that it will be prosecuted, you say it's less, you will feel it as less strong as far as the responsibility is applied, but you can see also as stronger because he will be prosecuted. But many times it's made in another form also, that we advise not to, it's better not to. So, but what was very interesting, you know that for instance, in language like Greek, you have the passive, then you have the active, and then you have a form which is called the medium, which is a kind in between the two, nor passive nor active. It's passive in the form and active thing, but then there is a very beautiful reflection of Spinoza. Spinoza wrote, I don't know if you know, a grammar of the Hebrew language. In this grammar of the Hebrew language, he analyzes the verbal form of the Hebrew verbal system, which is, as it says, neither passive nor active, but the agent and the patient are the same. It's a category of the verbal tense in which the agent and the patient coincide. Then he tries to translate this Latin, no? The text is written in Latin. And it's difficult to say, but it develops from this idea the concept of what you call the immanent cause, where you have again a subject which is both agent and patient. And this is this is a grammatical fact, because it starts from a grammatical fact, the form of the Hebrew verb. But then think how interesting it would be to think the subjectivity, where the agent and the patient coincide. Very interesting model, no? Very different from the idea of an active subject, then you have a passive subject distinguished. There they coincide. And it would be an interesting model to rethink subjectivity.
Thank you for walking us through your archaeology of commandment and sort of thinking about having walked through it with you. I'm starting to wonder what it could possibly mean to be free to be ethical, if will has been cut from can, if it has become more aligned with must or failure to must, as sort of what that opposite might be, and sort of really dissociated. If there's no access to can any longer, is there even a possibility of being ethical or free to be ethical, or is there an option for some sort of ethicogenesis of humans? I'm really stuck there.
No, I ask myself a lot, when working on this problem of possibility and then on this archaeology of will, etc. Can we conceive, for instance, an ethics grounded only on potentiality, grounded only on the can, and without the necessity of using the concept of will, freedom, because freedom goes a lot with will. And for instance, one possible example of this is, again, Spinoza's Ethics, where he strongly criticized the idea of a free will. So he builds his ethics without the necessity of a free will. But it is a problem. Can we conceive an ethics based on what you can and not on what you will? My idea is that it would be in some way more interesting. Is then really possible? Or the other possibility would be to let go both conception, potentiality and will, and try to look for a third concept.
I wonder if that's even possible. Early on in the first day, you talked about the idea of a field and kind of a magnetic pull between a positive and a negative charge, for example. And you had this field, and then there was the idea of sort of the must, will, can sort of triad. And it seems as though they got, imagine 3 magnets rather than 2. And it seems as though from the archaeology that led us through that triad of 3 poles was disrupted such that it's now flowing between this must and will, and this other thing is somewhere just by itself. And maybe this option for sort of rethinking the ethical is something about bringing that back together. So, I don't know, maybe making that field more complex.
Yeah, but the question, are will and can really compatible? Because, for instance, in Deleuze's reading of Spinoza Ethics, finally he formulates the ethical frame and the ethical concept in Spinoza through this question: what a body really can. So we don't know, recurs to the will, because a body does not will. So what a body can. And according to Deleuze, this is aim of the main answer, the main question in Spinoza ethics. So probably you can build an ethics on the concept of potentiality, only on what you can, and not on what you will. But I also tried to show how it is also true that the concept of will, in some way, developed from the concept of potentiality. And we saw Aristotle; it's very clear there. So your question was: we can try to rethink together the tree, bring back together all three. We can, like in the Spinoza project, on the contrary, only ground on potentiality and leaving for the other tools. We could also imagine another an ethics which will not be grounded on these three modal verbs. Because what is sure that our ethics, in a way or the other, has to do with these modal verbs. That's true, right? That's why the modal verbs are so important. It's true that our ethics, our politics, has to do with this modal verb. Either the three, either one against the other. But we could perhaps imagine also an ethics or a perspective which which will not employ these three modal verbs. I am very just to tell you what I'm also writing now. I found really interesting and fascinating the concept of usage, which seems to me being independent from can, will, must, being as another possibility of thinking human action in the form of but then it's very complicated to understand what does it mean to use, not of course in a utilitarian modern sense, the big sense which will also include habitude, form of life. My form of life is conceived in the form of in usage. But then, that's just to say there are many possibilities. But what I'm convinced that the model grounded on will, which is the prevailing model in our culture, is not good, must be abandoned. Then what can we do after? Go back to potentiality, open up a new space. But what I am convinced is the model, that's why I'm doing this archeology, the model of will, law, command, etc. is no good anymore.
In what way is this in what way is this related to individualism in our culture?
Sure, the model of the subject of as if the free willing subject goes with the idea of the individuality. So strangely enough, this model is then linked to the modern idea of thinking an individual, free subject who wills, etc., with free acts freely in the world. I think there is a link to these two conceptions. While the idea of potentiality is in some way non-individual, because you can imagine a potentiality which is there without the necessity to impute it to a subject. A potentiality can exist. That's why the list says a body, not a subject. What does a body can? So a body is neutral, a body, every body. So I think that will and individual go together, while potentiality not necessarily go with the individual. Yes. There were also other who wanted to speak up.
Just in relation to this idea of individuality.
Louder.
In relation to the question about individuality, it's interesting because when we, throughout the whole seminar, when we got to the point of will, we have to question how does the will form?
What does will
form? I mean,
it's
culture, it's education. How does the will form? So it does relate very much to this issue of individuality, where we have Paul saying, okay, I know how I should act, how does war work? I mean, is it just, yeah, it's a question I have. Of course, think about it. How does war work? Culture is
How does will form? How does it form? Yeah, what we try to see in our seminar from an archaeological perspective, how will was formed starting from the concept of potentiality and developing this, acting on it. And then, of course, the notion of will is always formed by education, etc. So, because, of course, what I am convinced is not natural for man to think this idea of will. It was many, many centuries were necessary to form this idea that there is, of course, a will. No, it's not natural at all, the idea that I will. So it's formed by cultural structure, politically, culturally. Who was that?
Just brought up the term usage, which I find very interesting, also in relation to the text you mentioned from Zone Reto of Neapolitan Technique. And I was wondering, reading this text, that maybe the reappropriation of technique, or there's this German word, Zweckentfremdung, which is much more vivid, much more vibrant. But could we call this reappropriation of products that have an intended telos, so to say? Could we call this a profanation in your?
Yeah. It is a profanation, and it employs the opening to a new usage.
Exactly.
Right. So we deactivate the normal commanded usage, and we open the space for a new possible usage. But the idea of usage is really interesting. For instance, because we have an instrumentality conception, we have an instrumental conception of usage. So we think there is a subject who, for his utility, uses something. But when we go back to, for instance, Greek, they don't have at all this conception. It's completely extraneous. And there is also a very interesting passage I find fascinating in Aristotle. At a certain point, he makes a distinction between what in Greek are called organa. Usually we translate instrument. Are organs, not instruments. So let it translate them. And he says there are first some organa, some, let's say, instrument, who are employed to produce something external. So, for instance, it's clear that something is used to. He makes the example, for instance, of the plectrum that a player of sitar makes. That is produced to produce the music. So there are instruments who are meant, and they are the normal instruments, to produce an object. But then he says there are instruments who produces nothing except their usage. And he makes this marvelous example, the bed. I found fantastic, you know? It's the idea of making a philosophy of the bed. It's true, no? So the bed is something we use, but it's not productive. It's not an instrument to produce. We are so perverted that perhaps we can conceive the bed as an instrument to sleep, to rest. Evidently for a Greek, it was clear that a bed, and even I say a vest, is something that does not produce anything except their usage. It's interesting, this idea that there is something that is only used without any end, without any goal.
We also find the notion of the desirable object again, I think.
Then?
The object that is desirable and, how do you say, verfügung, seduces the subject in a way?
Seduces the subject, yeah. Fascinates the subject.
Yeah, and
attracts the subject.
Yeah. But the subject puts new meanings to the object.
Yeah, no question. I just had a few thoughts that came up over the course of the presentation in the past few days. First, this notion of the commandment, and particularly in the context of legal rules set up in the state, and I particularly thought about the former Commonwealth countries where in a post-colonial setting, a number of them, when they kicked out the British, for example, they set up their own head of state. But there's some countries that still have the Queen of England as the head of state, including Canada. So anytime you pass a law, it conceivably before it gets gets sent across the Atlantic to be pulled away, and this notion of like who's in control, who's in power, this type of thing. Secondly, around this notion of sort of retribution around the oath, when an oath is broken, the kind of sanctioning systems that are in place. And in some Aboriginal cultures, when an individual, steals something or commits some sort of thing that breaks the community bond, there are situations where the individual isn't sanctioned, the entire village gets together, and the question isn't what did this person do wrong, the question is what did we do wrong. So this notion of collective justice, collective retribution, collective reconciliation, which is just such a different way of looking at some of these questions.
It's not a question.
No, just a comment. Yeah.
What about conceptions of ethics that are not grounded on the individual but on the social condition? We are born, we are social beings, and my ethics is not based on me being a free-willing individual, but on the fact that we share, for example, a certain precarity. I'm thinking especially of Judith Butler giving an account of oneself, where she draws on Derrida and La Planche and Arendt.
I'm not sure that they are incompatible, because in some way, in our Western tradition, they can go together in a way. There is the idea that there is a free will, free individual, but then we partake, we share certain traditions, certain concepts. I don't think they are really incompatible. Of course, you will never have an individual which is free of making anything. No? Of course, they can go together. So I don't think that there is really a strong position.